What's up, everybody? I'm going to be doing a product review on a Nintendo Wii. It's called a Boss Big Oversized Super Shell. And basically what it is, it mimics a regular controller, but you put the Wii remote inside like this. And as you can tell, if you look underneath, all the buttons have little rubber plungers basically, which will touch the buttons and move them accordingly. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Okay. It's actually a little tricky. There we go. This part here actually pulls in order to get it out. Alright, so I'm sure everybody has seen this in either online or at a GameStop usually. It's usually about 10 bucks, I think. It's pretty cheap, but I figured I'd explain a couple of things about this, why it could be good or bad depending on what you're using it for. Now, on the plus side, it is big. And depending on how big your hands are, if you're a small child, this might be too big. But generally, it's got good size to it, and that is a plus in itself. We're going to compare this real quick to the classic controller, which is also, it's for the Wii. It's actually a little bit bigger than it. Let's see if I set this on top, you can see the outside edges. But it is bigger, but it basically has the same feel. The directional pads actually work fairly well. And then you have your B, actually your 1 and your 2 button, which is supposed to simulate sort of a Nintendo versus Super Nintendo crossover controller. That's where the design is coming from. So let's actually look at a Super Nintendo controller, which is actually my favorite controller. Obviously, with a Super Nintendo controller, you have bumpers on it. You're not going to have it with this. It's basically, it's only a skin, so you're getting all the buttons that you normally have. But this, it's obviously smaller. But that's the design. So that's just a comparison of the two. And of course, we have an original Nintendo controller, which is square and much smaller. Now, as for functionality, the biggest problem that I have with this thing is the 1 and the 2 buttons being the direction that they are. Of course, if you're familiar with Mario Brothers and other types of games, you need to hold one down while hitting the other. And of course, if you used a Super Nintendo controller, you would hit Y and B. And notice that your thumb is actually sideways, instead of trying to play like that. So with this thing, my biggest complaint, all they would have had to have done to make this controller actually decent is to switch the angle of these buttons to that. So when you play it, it's more natural with your thumb. But unfortunately, they did the opposite, which actually makes it worse when you are trying to play like a Mario game. You go to try to hit the side of the button with your thumb, and you'll find yourself missing it, or you're not pressing it good enough, because as you know, it's not actually the button, it's pressing the button on the controller. So that's the biggest issue with it. But on the same token, you can use this on any type of game that requires just the Wii remote and not the nunchuck, because it still keeps intact the sensor. So that's also a plus. But in general, I think that if they would have just fixed these 2 buttons, this would have been a good buy. But unfortunately, with most games, it doesn't really work that well. So what else did I want to compare it to? Now, of course, you're asking yourself, why would you get this skin when you can use this? Well, I've noticed that with some of the games that you get for the classic console, you still have that problem where 1 and 2 is actually B and A. So when you're playing a game, even though you get a good D-pad, you still have to do the B and A sideways like this, or try to roll your thumb. It's a little easier with this, believe it or not, than with the bigger controller, even though the buttons are bigger on the other one, because these are the real buttons. It's easier to press. But I still have that issue of playing Mario Brothers like this. So pretty much the only solution is just to use the Wii remote just like itself. I gave it a lot of time and a lot of practice to see if I can get used to it. And in the end, try to get this freaking thing back out. In the end, I ended up liking the Wii Remote just like this because at least the buttons are sideways and it more or less mimics an original Nintendo button control setup. Some games allow you to change, like if you're using the classic, some games allow you to change the direction, but most of the classic games don't. You can't change it. You're stuck with these two things. So in the end, for those who are having that issue, you're gonna have to probably stick with this. You can try this out if you want, but I said the biggest thing is the fact that rolling over to the number 2 is actually pretty difficult, and you'll find yourself not hitting the button correctly. So we actually got this for about $5. We tried it out, and I pretty much never use it, but it was really close. It was almost good, but of course they failed with these two buttons. And if you were able to turn these at some point, it would have solved the problem. As you can tell, it still just does the plungers in 2 exact spots, so I don't know why they designed it that way. So anyway, that's my little opinion on that. I'd probably stay away from this if I were you.